Hi everybody, it's Max Hale here again. In our last get together I talked about brushes for use with oil and acrylic, and this time we're going to do the same but with brushes for watercolour and gouache. Now, they are both the same in as much as they're light watercolour brushes, in as much that they carry water as opposed to thick paint. So consequently their requirement and their constitution is much different, simply because they have a different job to do. If you remember, acrylic and oil paints use brushes which are quite stiff. They have a very sort of hard spring rather than being soft and flexible, which is what watercolour brushes tend to be. Now, the reason for that is when you're painting oil and acrylics, your paint is mixed up, ready to go, apart from any diluent you might want to add to it. But on the whole, it's a much more robust medium with a lot more viscosity. Whereas watercolour and gouache really are very much less so. And in fact, if you can think about it, the reason that they're very different, of course, is they come in different formats. Although they come in tubes, it's almost impossible to think that you would use a tube of watercolour in the same way as you would use oil or acrylic. You'd always put some water in it. So you create the thickness or the viscosity of paint that you're using according to what you're going to paint and how you're going to go about it. So the reason that we have a different type of makeup of brush is because with watercolour, hence the clue is in the title, the majority of what you're painting with tends to be almost every time more water than there is pigment in holding it in the brush. So the constitution of the paint and the brush need to be commensurately different. Now, when we went through the brushes with oil and acrylic, you may remember that on the whole most of them were square-headed, slightly rounded, and were on the whole flat, not rounded. Now, the reason for that is that the brush needs to be able to not only spread a fairly thick paint, but it has to be strong enough to place that paint down with quite a robust stroke, so you might put a fair bit of pressure on it. With watercolour, it's, I wouldn't say the opposite, but there's a lot less pressure put on the brush to create what we call brush marks. Most of the marks that are made are a lot fewer, really, because the water tends to carry the brush marks away, mainly because that's what we like and what's necessary for painting with such a wet medium. So let's start with the first brush. Now, in watercolour, rather than acrylic or oil, the most popular brush really is the round. The round brush is probably about 75% or 80% of what people use to paint with watercolour. When I say majority, mostly because of several reasons. It has several different methods of use. One is that you're able to shift a lot of water, so the makeup of the brush is a much softer makeup. They can bend very easily, they're very soft and quite pleasant to feel, as opposed to watercolour, acrylic and oil, which are much stiffer and robust beasts, whereas the watercolour one has a lot more flexibility. It bends very easily and spreads out very easily, splays out. But the main reason for the softness and many more hairs is that it needs to hang on to the water with the pigment mixed in it, so that you can then place it, move it about, touch it, draw with it, whatever you're going to do, and it can be a reservoir of pigment in there mixed up with the water. And the bigger the brush, the more water it holds, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. And the smaller the brush, the less water. So consequently, if you're going to be painting a large area, you need to have quite a large brush. Now, round brushes are the most popular because they tend to be more flexible. You've got flexibility as much that they will go everywhere. They can press them one way, another way, and of course when they're wet, excuse me for doing this, you have in fact a very nice point on there, which allows you to use it for quite small detail. Now, on the whole, most of my students and other people I've taught will have probably not a brush as big as this. This is a size 16, but it will be this sort of size, which is probably something like, that looks like a 5 or a 4 brush, quite small, and somewhere in between, which is a 10. So there we've got a 16, a 10, and I think that must be a 6. I can't see it anywhere, but I suspect that's a 6. So those three sizes I'll probably give you most that you need in the round brush sector, and I'll show you shortly how you use those to lay down your washes. So round brushes. The other brush that's very popular, and up until 3-4 years ago, I used to use flat square brushes such as these, all different sizes, as my main brush, because you can in fact do quite a lot with these as well. Even though they are flat, they're great for covering lots of big area because you've got a flat wide distribution, but also the corner of them here, that little corner, can be your detail brush, so you can just go in with that and just touch the corner. That will give you a little few marks. Good for doing lines as well. So you can not only do this, but you can place the brush on your paper and continue down to make a line. Not particularly hard to use, but many of the people I taught found that their preference was not for a flat brush. But I love them, and I think they're great, and they're really useful. I'll show you later on how much better they are at laying down flat washes. Very much better, because you're literally covering an area much bigger. Now the difference with flat brushes is that they don't come in numbers as in normal round brushes, which will be usually something like 00 up until 16 in what I would call the catalogue, the usual brush catalogue. These are measured in widths. Not only are they measured in widths, but they're measured in imperial measurements. So when you go and buy a brush such as these, the thing to ask for is a 3/4 inch, which is one of these, an inch, which is that, or one of these little devils, which is 1.25 inches. So in a way, that's a 1/2 inch. In a way, we've sort of gone back in time with these, but that's how they are. So when you're buying flat brushes, you need to make sure you buy the right one for your size you're painting. I generally use, my favourite really is the 1.75 inch or 3/4. The 1.25 is great if you're doing a big piece, and I use it quite a lot too. If I'm using a small palette with half pans, I'm restricted to a smallish brush, and the reason for that, of course, is I can't really get the brush in the small pan. So if you're using pans, the chances are you will have to utilise a small flat, or when you're mixing, you can mix it into a palette and use it from there, so you've got a bigger space to put your brush. But if you're using a round brush, of course, the round brush culminates in a nice point, so you can use that in almost any size palette, or of course if you're using tubes. So the round brush and the square brush, these are the most popular of the watercolour stable. And one thing that you probably are aware of is that if you were a watercolour painter some years ago, let's say, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, these synthetic head brushes, these are made of mostly nylon, were very few and far between. They weren't very sophisticated. They were a bit crude. The bristles were very thick and not particularly good to deal with. And in fact, these ones now are so good. They're my favourites. I love the synthetic brushes. I think they're absolutely brilliant. You would be buying, in years gone by, Sable. Now, Sable brushes are still available. Sable, in fact. But one of the reasons that people buy fewer of them and now go to these is because the price is so high. This is my first, believe it or not, my very first Sable brush. It's a Rowney, not even Dana Rowney, size 12. And I think this, if my memory serves me correctly, was about 65 to 70 pounds for that one brush. So if you were a serious watercolourist, you would be compelled by pressure from your peers and elsewhere to spend your money on these wonderful brushes, which are fine. They're no better, I promise you, in my opinion, than one of these or one of these, and they are a darn sight more expensive. So be very careful. Don't be fooled into thinking that Sable brushes are everything, because nowadays synthetic ones are equally as good. I love them because I think they're good value, and I can buy half a dozen of them for the price of one of these. That's got to be a good deal, hasn't it? Righty-ho, let's pop that back in there. Big respect to this brush. This started me off on my journey with watercolour. That was about oh gosh, well, a long time ago. Right, so we've done square, we've done round. These particular brushes, these flat ones, all the same, as you can see, for their coloration of the handles, and the ferrules are all made by a company called ProArte, P-R-O--A-R-T-E, and they are in fact what we call Prolene Plus, P-R-O-L-E-N-E, Prolene Plus, and they are so good, really are excellent. Now, a lot of companies make these brushes as in synthetic hair. Prolene are my favourites, I have to say. I'm very sorry to all the other brush manufacturers which I've tried, and they all make good brushes, but you know, it's a bit like anything. Once you get hold of something that works so well, you're reluctant to change, and these are particularly good. Rosemary & Co, again, fabulous brushes. They make them under a different name, their own name, Rosemary, and they'll have a classic name as well. And they are very good, there's no doubt about it. They're not bad brushes at all, in fact they're very good. And Jackson's own make are very good. I've tried others, but you know what it's like when you get used to something, you just keep using it, don't you? Right, so they're the two main types of brush, the flat and the round. Flat, round. Round because it goes all the way round, no different side, all the same. The flats naturally are flat, but if you turn them sideways, they're very narrow, and that means you've got another string to your bow, really. You can paint with them not only this way, but this way, and of course if you press hard, they'll splay out and make some lovely shapes and allow the water to flow. So the more pressure you put on the brush when you've got it loaded with water, the more the water flows, and then you can push it wherever you like. So the importance of bigger brushes is, again, reiterate that, is that it carries a lot more water and pigment. So here we are. I've got my palette, and I've got quite a lot of pigment in there, and I'm going to add a drop more water. Now when you're mixing or you're taking paint from your palette, what you need to do is to be able to remember where you are on your painting and how much water you need. Obviously, if I was mixing this and I was halfway through the painting, the chances are I would use less water, because once you've got your paint, your initial paint down, I'm using Rembrandt, by the way. These are Rembrandt watercolours, in my opinion, They're the best. Now I've got quite a lot of water there, not too much, but for the first washes, you've got to be able to see the paint running around in your palette. Now with a big brush like this, you can move a lot of water around. So if you're doing a wash, put a little bit more in there. Doesn't matter what you end up with your brush, you're going to end up with quite a flat wash, and you need to be able to move that around quickly with your fairly big brush. Now it doesn't matter what you do with that while it's soaking wet, that will pretty much dry out as a flat wash. If I was to use less water, even with this same brush, and try and produce another wash, maybe a slightly more, well, I say slightly more, a little bit darker, so I've added a little bit more pigment. This is a slightly different colour, so you can differentiate. But if you don't wet your brush enough, so if you were using smaller brushes and you didn't put as much water on, what you would end up with is quite a lot of what I call noise in there. But you can see how beautiful that one is, how lovely and flat it is. From there to there, up and down, there's no change in the colour. Whereas with the other one, where I put less water, as you can see, there's quite a lot of movement in there, quite a lot of change in the way the drying process has happened. So the more water you use with your brush, hence the reason why the brushes have to be quite big, is that it will give you a lot of stability in your washes. Now I'm going to use a flat brush. This is the same make as the other one. This is a Pro Arty Proline Plus, but it's flat, not round. So I've mixed up some cobalt blue in here. Just run it off the palette. Still quite wet, quite a lot of water in there, because I want to show you how this behaves, this flat brush. Now you saw with the round one that you could paint pretty straightforward with it. Now this, really a flat brush, is great for doing large swathes of colour. So very much easier to get a block of paint down on your paper if you're mixing up for washes. I've made that quite wet, but I wanted to show you how much you could use, how much water you can work with a flat brush. Now I'm not saying flat brushes are perfect, because they all have their usage, but flat brushes are brilliant for putting in quite a lot of paint, and obviously for putting in a lot of pigment as well. Now that's much easier to use really than a round brush for ordinary flat washes. Round brushes are fine, but you'd have to use quite a big one, or what we call a mop. Mops are big fat round brushes which give you a certain amount of movability with your water as well. Okay, just quickly then, let me just run over the whole set of these brushes. Round brush, normally from size 00 to about 16. You can buy bigger, but on the whole they are special order. Flat brushes from usually about 1/4 of an inch up until about 1 1/4 inches that I showed you. Look at the side view, quite narrow. This is here is a rigger, so quite a long length of bristle, but certainly not many hairs for doing very fine work. This one you haven't seen. This is a relatively new, probably in the last 10-12 years, what they call a sword liner. As you can see, it's shaped like a point with a large area at the bottom. Useful for, I guess, multi-purpose. I've never used one, but I think mainly because you've got the ability to carry a fair bit of water at the base, and also it be a detail brush. Now they also do one which is cropped off about here, so it's sort of like a short sword, like an angled brush. And similarly with flat brushes, you can find them with every other hair chopped out to give like a rake look, which will give you a particular effect on your painting. This is the mop, of course, either flat at the end or going right the way around into a large, ovally shaped, mainly for carrying water with pigment, to do really quite large areas. That's really what it's for. The hake, 2 types, one with very short bristles, one with slightly longer, really to do with personal taste, nothing to do with it will change slightly, because of course if the bristles are longer they will stroke the water more. This one's likely to sort of aquaplane them along a little bit. So in some respects they are different, but very similar in what they will produce. The main thing you remember is that the hake is flat. It doesn't have a round handle like these have. It's a flat handle, and that's the reason. The reason is that they're meant to be kept in that flat shape. Very rarely would you use one sideways. And last but not least, you've got the fan brushes for specialist work, doing little flicks, you know, doing shapes and maybe skimming across colour to give a special effect. But one thing about watercolour brushes is that this is the basic stable. There are manufacturers are making new ones all the time, different types, different lengths of hair, different types of handle, and growing the use of watercolour brushes, mainly because there is a demand, but secondly to create a demand for people doing particular types of work. If you're doing watercolour landscape, you might use, you know, more mop and the hake. You might not use quite so many of the smaller brushes or the round, but it's really down to you as the painter to decide which is best for your use. Personally, I only have these 3. Oh, and a fan, but as you can see, I never used it. But on the whole, mostly these 3 will do you proud. You don't really need much more. But if you want to try them, of course, do so. I've tried them and don't have a use for them, but you know, that's up to me. But all I can say at this point is I'm very grateful for you dropping in. It's great to see you again. I hope you're keeping well and that your painting is going well, and certainly we'll be back again to talk about what we paint on, so that what we call support, so that's paper, canvas, board, all sorts of things, will be my next one, and you can see the differences in how they perform. So thanks again, look after yourselves, take care, and bye for now. Thanks.